Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our second City Futures Research Center seminar for this term. My name is Dr. Lee Roberts. I'm one of the two organizers for the seminar series. I'll start with a little bit of housekeeping, and then I'll turn it over to Professor Hal Pawson to do the introduction today. Before I start, though, I just want to acknowledge that University of New South Wales Kensington campus is located on the unceded lands of the Bidjigal people of the Eora Nation. And I'd just like to pay my respects to elders past and present and any First Nations people who may be joining us today. So just a request for people joining us online, if you can mute your microphone and turn off your camera during the presentation, that would be great. And then when we get to Q&A at the end, feel free to turn those back on if you want to ask a question live, or if you want to put questions into the chat. Richard will be monitoring that from the back, so please, you can put those in at any time. And with that, I'll turn it over to Professor Hal Pawson, who's the Associate Director of City Futures Research Center, to introduce today's speaker.
Thanks very much, Lee, and welcome to those in the room and in the virtual room as well. Very pleased to introduce my UK colleague, Professor Mark Stephens, who's here on study leave at the moment. And Mark and I go back quite a long way. We've worked together for 20 years or so. And I know Mark very well, and so I don't really need his bio, you might think, but I brought it with me because Mark does have a very grand title, and I think we really should introduce him by this. So Mark is the Ian McTaggart Chair of Land, Property and Urban Studies at the University of Glasgow. I don't think anyone here has got such a grand title as that. But Mark, in fact, also has a reputation in the world of housing studies as large or larger than that title, particularly in the field of comparative housing research. And Mark's published many papers on that topic, and he's kind of looked up to by a lot of people who do those kinds of comparisons, and we're very keen on that kind of thing in Australia ourselves, and your work is often quoted in that. And also Mark's got a very long-standing interest in housing and poverty, housing and social security and welfare systems generally. So Mark is going to speak today about really a sort of methodological as well as a topic of methodological interest, as well as the substance of what comes out of a recent research project. And it sort of follows from the theme, or it chimes, I think, with the theme of citizens panels, which has recently, come back to the top of the agenda, or it's recently been referred to once again in Australia. And there's currently a proposal, I think, from the so-called Teal members of the Lower House of Parliament in convening a citizens panel on the topic of housing policy, which is a pretty huge undertaking, I think, and we'll see how feasible that is. But Mark's the project that Mark will talk about, I think, has a little bit of a connection with that in terms of researching citizen views about particular devices or policy instruments. So over to you, Mark.
Okay. Thank you very much, Hal, for the introduction, and to UNSW for inviting me here today. So this project we call the Contested Politics of Residential Space, and you can see the names of my colleagues with whom I've been working on this. So where did this project come from? Because it's really outside my kind of usual areas of research, which Hal outlined. But there was a link, which is that in my work on housing and poverty, I became interested in the development of so-called consensual approaches to poverty lines and to debt deprivation. So, I mean, expect most of you are familiar that poverty is sort of normally measured as 50 or 60% of median income. And that, of course, is entirely arbitrary without any real meaning. So in response to that, there have been attempts to engage with citizens in an informed manner to find out what the societal view is on what minimum living standards should be. So, for example, the Roundtree Foundation has developed a minimum income standard based on that approach. So I began to wonder if it could be applied more directly to housing, and in particular into, well, how much housing is it reasonable for people to consume. I did find that the UK charity and housing lobby group Shelter had actually visited this area in quite a substantial and well-funded piece of research on housing standards. But I'll speak about it in a minute. But it was rather, it kind of stopped halfway, and so it seemed worth looking at the area in more detail. So our formal aim was to seek to advance understanding of attitudes towards racial residential space standards in the UK. And our approach, well, we had quite limited resources. So we decided to focus on three particular policies in the UK that give incentives, if you like, about whether people should consume more or less accommodation. And I'll just outline what those policies are, because they're kind of essential to understanding the discussions that follow. So the first one relates to the council tax. The council tax is a tax that is based on the value of your property, rather imperfectly, but it is related to that, and it's levied by local authorities to pay for local services. But it can be characterised as being a hybrid tax, so it's partly based on property values, but if you are the only adult living in property, then you get a 25% discount, and that was justified on the basis that you consume fewer services than a larger household. So I would characterise it as also having a service charge element in it. So that's that one. And the thing that we were addressing was whether there should be a single person's discount on it. Second one relates to our housing allowance or housing benefit, which is the rough equivalent of rent assistance in the privately rented sector. And there is a rule that was first introduced in the 1990s, but then extended about a decade ago, which says that if you are a single person below a certain age, then the most rent, or the calculation will be based on the rent of shared accommodation. So, in other words, accommodation shared with people with whom you're not related to. So like a shared student house type arrangement. And the cut-off point used to be 25, but it was raised to 35. And the third policy is another one that was introduced in the sort of austerity era after 2010, and this is applied to social tenants. And again, it relates to their housing benefit. And what it says is that if you have one spare room, one that you don't need, then your benefit gets reduced by 14%. If you have two or more spare rooms, then it's reduced by a quarter. And that is known as, popularly, everyone calls it the bedroom tax. The government calls it the that's subsidy. It's just one of those things everyone calls it. So these are quite controversial policies, and I think in particular this one, the bedroom tax, is really is the most controversial in the sense that it kind of pits people in need against one another. It's saying that, like, you know, you're in a social house and you're under occupying it, and there's someone out there on the waiting list who might, you know, who could fully occupy it, you know, so that it creates that kind of tension in the rhetoric around it when it was introduced. That's precisely the kind of argument advanced. But also note that this one falls in a different direction from these two. So that this one is an encouragement to consume housing if you like, whereas this one is not. And so it's entirely possible that you could be a social tenant who is have your benefit deducted, bedroom tax, but you also gain a single person's discount from the council tax. So there's a kind of tension there. So we were wondering, how do you negotiate this maze of conflicting signals, and what kind of trade-offs would people think about in policy? And I think it might. Well, we thought it might challenge the way in which we as researchers often go about this. I mean, we could easily use household surveys to, you know, work out what might be generally accepted as being whether these policies favour poorer or richer people in more or less need. But that kind of has an embedded value system in it, a kind of utilitarian one. And, you know, who are these values that are shared by wider population? I'll do a very quick well, it's not really a literature review, it's just highlighting two pieces of things that might be relevant. One is that in kind of official policy terms, we do have a concept of statutory overcrowding, but the standard was set in 1935, and I don't think anyone really knows why it was set as it was in 1935. And you might have expected, I mean, you know, the economy must have grown several times over since 1935, but this hasn't changed. So the last Labour government did legislate to allow it to be improved and anticipated as it might, but it hasn't changed since. And instead, we've had the sort of post-2010, post-financial crisis austerity era, or the direction of travel has been about rationing space rather than increasing it. Now, this piece of work that Shelter undertook, I referred to earlier, I mean, they adopted one of these consensual approaches. It was a very substantial piece of work. And they identified 19 essential attributes over 5 domains of affordability, decent space, stability, and neighbourhood. And they also had an array of desirable ones. So they created a standard that was made up of meeting the essential attributes and a proportion of the desirable ones. So immediately, by doing that approach, you're reintroducing a kind of arbitrary element into it, which is quite, you know, not unusual with these consensus approaches. And also, the application was fairly limited in the sense that the standards are articulated in sort of capability space, so privacy or enough space, that kind of thing, rather than commodity space. So it never got through to asking people, well, what do you think the actual space you need is? And so it doesn't really give us any basis for establishing trade-offs. So we decided to take, I think, a deliberative approach. I think is probably the best way to describe it. There's quite a bit of some good papers written by Tanya Burchard and colleagues at LSE about 10 years ago on this, and in one of her papers, she identifies these as being key elements of it. So that these approaches are different from just say having a focus group where you just let people express their views in a structured way. But here it's supposed to be informed, considered, and done through a process of public reason. So it's guided in some way, and so you do provide information and evidence to participants at the outset, written and oral. So we did that, and there's an expectation that participants' beliefs and values may be transformed through the process of deliberation. So what did we do? Well, we held a pilot workshop in Glasgow, and that turned out to be very valuable. It did greatly inform how we designed the sort of real workshops that followed. In particular, that we find that people just all agreed that X policy was wonderful or awful, and that was it. So we had to sort of introduce ways of, and we'll see it in a moment, ways of teasing out prioritization and getting values to come to the surface and this kind of thing. So that was actually very valuable. Our resources were limited, so all we did was to hold 2 one-day workshops in Glasgow and London. So sorry, that's confusingly phrased. That's only one in each city, and they had 10 participants in Glasgow and 9 in London. So we did manage to achieve a reasonable variety of background in terms of age, gender, what tenure people were living in, without getting to be representative. So the literature on deliberative methods doesn't demand that you are representative. In fact, they sometimes encourage you to go to unrepresentative groups that don't normally have a voice. And just over half the participants have experienced at least one of these policies, and all the policies were represented, if you like. So there's at least someone who'd experienced from in each group. And we also found that the levels of awareness before the process started very quickly. So this is an outline of everything we did. You can guess that it was one of my colleagues who turned us into this nice graphic. So before deliberation started, participants were given written briefings about each of the policies. They also asked to complete a questionnaire to find out what their initial kind of views were at the start. The main deliberation process is outlined here. So we started by giving them a repeat briefing to remind them of what the written summaries, and they had the opportunity to ask sort of factual questions. So we very much, our role was obviously not to enter the discussions or debates, but we were there to answer factual questions about the details of the policies. We then, most of us then left the room. We did leave one person there to deal with any technical problems because they were recorded, and to answer any factual questions. So the participants were asked to elect or select a chair or a rapporteur. So they kind of had a first round discussion with a few prompting questions on a screen. And then after that, we came back in and the rapporteur gave a kind of summary of the discussion that far. And again, we were there to answer any questions, clarification. The next part of it was possibly the most interesting, which is that in other research, I've used so-called vignettes as a way of elucidating how people might react in particular situations. And we decided to do that, but we also had a little experiment that most vignettes you just make up the scenario and write it on a piece of paper and present it to the participants. So we decided to see if we could find real life ones, record them as videos. Recruitment was exceptionally difficult, but we did find some. And so we did have people who had experienced or benefited from the single person's discount or had experienced the shared accommodation rate and so on. So we thought that would kind of turn it into reality for people, if you like. And I think it did that. The downside of it is that people's life stories, of course, are often very complicated. So there is that element to it. So we showed them two of these vignettes, and then there was a discussion. And then what we did was we put in a third one, which I've started calling the disruptor. Now this was hypothetical, partly because we just couldn't find someone in these situations, but these were designed to perhaps challenge what the discussion had focused on that far. And you'll see what I mean when we get to some actual examples. So then there's another sort of round-up session. The rapporteur provided an account of the discussion. Again, there's an opportunity for clarifying questions, and they were asked if they reached a consensus. So and all of this was recorded and transcribed later. Then we had a sort of final round of deliberation. Again, this was designed to try and bring the values that people had, the things that made them choose particular decisions to a head, really. So what we did was we said, okay, the government's short of money. There's only one of these policies that we can have, on the generous side, right? And so which one are you going to choose? And then we said, well, we found a bit more money, choose two. So there was a prioritisation process there. And again, they were encouraged to come to a consensus and to justify their decisions. Then after all of this, they completed another questionnaire, and the idea is that we could track to see whether their views have changed through the process. I've already explained about the vignettes, so we'll come back to this. Here's an example of one of the vignettes. This is for the single person's discount for the council tax. So this is one of the real ones. And again, there was a film of this. So Helen, an elderly woman, age 73, lives alone, 3-bedroom house, in which she and her late husband had bought from the council on the right to buy. Retired teacher with a modest pension, and so she receives the discount of about £300 on a £1,200 council tax bill. So a sort of reasonably common and probably sympathetic kind of case. And we had a second one was I think she was a lone parent who was in work, who benefited from it. But then we could so they were both quite sympathetic. Ones people would like to be sympathetic towards them. So we threw in this was a hypothetical disruptor. So we got the bond dealer, a trader from the City of London who earns £250,000 with bonuses, lives in a 3-bedroom apartment, so if you like the same scale of under occupation, worth over £1 million. on your shoebox again, but so so they get this gap. So that's obviously one that was intended to challenge people's views on it. So afterwards, everything recorded and just transcribed. Same researcher did the same policy across both workshops, the Glasgow. They summarised the discussions and the evolution of the arguments through the day and selected some key quotes, and then we did an overview to see if, taking everything together to see if we could come up with any common values. So I'll try and run through the way in which the council facts discount discussions evolved. I've merged the two workshops. We don't have time to go through them separately. So in the initial sort of discussion, there was general support for this the principle of a discount on the service charge argument, really. And so, just an example, if you use less, we didn't have a grammar police there. So if you use less of the council facilities and everything else, I think you should pay less. And if you use more, you should pay more. So that's female aged 45 to 55 owner occupied in London to that view, but it was quite common. When we early on, we asked them to choose between the elderly female pensioner, Helen, we saw in the working lady parent, and we got two different kind of sets of arguments. You got those who use the service charge argument that because Emma, the lone parent, has a child, she's presumably using more council services, so as kind of less deserving. But then on the other hand, there was people would argue that, well, if you have a child, that should take priority. So we had a conflict there. When we introduced the bond dealer, this again created different views. So some people, particularly in Glasgow for some reason, some people, stuck to their guns that they'd had earlier and said, if you want to follow the same standards as you've said before, then yes, you should get the discount. But then someone else sort of said quite the opposite, that it shows the complete inequity of using the less services arguments. So in regards to that argument as being a bit bogus. He's patently well off, he's patently doing well, but he hasn't done well in isolation. He's done well by being a member of society. So that was a middle-aged male in London. So that shared accommodation rate. So this is if you're under 35 and single, then your housing allowance is based on a rent for shared accommodation. So this brought out very strong opposition in the sort of first round of what we might call the principal discussion. So arbitrary, because your needs are the same regardless of your age. Very strong thing that came out about the right to live in self-contained accommodation, the sort of right to a home. I've added home, that wasn't word was used, but I think it kind of falls into that category. And then I think these were from Glasgow, that words like punitive, discriminatory, unfair came out very strongly in the discussions. So we had the first two vignettes, which were reasonably sympathetic cases. I think there was someone who'd been trying to get a disability assessment, which would have exempted them from it, but it took them ages to get the disability assessment. So during that period, they were subject to the shared accommodation rate. And so when these cases were presented, the views remain the same. It probably reinforces it, in my view. I think it's particularly dehumanizing, making this arbitrary line in the sand between people under and over 35. So that's a woman 25 to 34 living in private rented accommodation in Glasgow. And someone else, it seems to be a piece of legislation where adults are treated like children. There's no humanity in it. So it's really very powerful language that people use, more so than with the council tax. But we did introduce a sort of less sympathetic example, the disruptor. I think it was like an 18-year-old who was living perfectly happily with their parents and just decided that they felt like living by themselves. So that did bring out some different views. If you talk to someone who's actually going to say to him at 18, why don't you stay with mum and dad, go to college, pick yourself up, 2 or 3 A levels, school leaving exams, think about what you're going to do next. That's a 65-year-old woman, social tenant in London. But still, even with a not particularly sympathetic case, the opposition to it generally remains pretty strong. I still feel an 18-year-old is not a child, they're a young person. I'm failing to see the difference between 18 and 28 or 38 in terms of policy. And another one, age should not come into it, so we should get what someone over 35 would get, doing the job the same hours. And on to the bedroom tax. So this is quite interesting. I mean, politically, this has probably been the most controversial of the policy, to the extent that in Scotland and Northern Ireland, it's fully mitigated by the Scottish Government or Northern Ireland governments. So that's the one of these are the policies that kind of really gain traction, to the extent that in some parts of the UK, politicians are willing to spend public money in mitigating it. But in the initial discussions, sort of the in-principle ones, I think it was really the practicalities of it that people raised, rather than in principle it's wrong. So this one, it doesn't take account of children whose main residences elsewhere. So I suppose, say, divorced parents, so when the children visit the primary carer, then you need another bedroom. And this one, the way it's implemented isn't fair at all. Even the exemption for non-resident carers, it was never really about incentivizing people to downsize. It was just because they don't want to spend money on benefits. Well, that's actually quite perceptive, because that's precisely what's happened, is that hardly anyone's moved. So it just means they get less support. But there were people who supported it. So this is a woman aged over 65, social tenant in London. If you're under-occupying your home and you cannot afford that home, you should move. You shouldn't be paid state transfers in order to stay in a particular place, whether that's your home or not. So someone completely aligned with the kind of arguments that we used to introduce it. Interesting. So we had vignettes, so we had vignettes. I suppose in the first two were reasonably sympathetic cases, and again the opposition still very strong. Makes me so angry, both stories. I'm absolutely disgusted that the government would impose such a penalty on people. Like I said, the most vulnerable are suffering because of this. What right does the government have to incentivize people to downgrade? I think meant downsize. So, I think this idea of home kind of keeps coming into this. What seems to have happened over the years with these policies is the aspect of the right to live in your home in peaceful enjoyment or whatever, and some sort of expectation that that would continue has been eroded. So again, I think this sort of right to the home. But again, not universal, and perhaps this is what you might expect given this person's circumstances. They're 35 to 44 living in private renting in London. So I'm in the PRS, private rental sector. I have two children, a girl and a boy, that share a bedroom because I cannot afford a 3-bedroom. And that is the rule of fairness, if you ask me. So we added a disruptor. We anticipated that most people would be against the bedroom tax. So what we did was the disruptor was someone who was obviously in need of social housing, but couldn't get access to it. So we introduced that. So still people, would hold out against that. So I don't think it justifies people having to move out of their family homes. It doesn't matter. It doesn't really justify that based on someone else's needs. Someone else needs it more. There's always someone else needs it more. And someone else pointed to, well, actually, it's we're living in a system where the system has failed. Penalising the people before first two vignettes is not going to help Judith at all, not one iota. And what we're talking about today is really underpinned by a failure of housing policy since God knows when. Again, a similar point that the problem is bigger than that. The problem is that we are underinvested in housing, and we've got countless policies that prevent us doing the right thing. When it came to trade-offs, if there was only one of these policies you could keep in the generous direction, which would it be? And there was a difference in opinion. So in Glasgow, they prioritised abolishing the bedroom tax. In London, they prioritised abolishing the shared accommodation rate. But the second choice in Glasgow was to abolish the shared accommodation rate, and in London, abolish the bedroom tax. So the top two are the same, which of course therefore means that the lowest priority was keeping the single person's discount at the council tax. In the discussions that the groups had about prioritisation, the arguments, in my view, became more consequentialist and utilitarian. So it's kind of what's the outcome of doing this rather than appealing to higher principles. So it's the relative impact of the policies that mattered. And also things like, well, if we change this, would people be able to adapt? How would they adapt to it? Particular references to sort of hypothetically low incomes or people with disabilities. So kind of, we thought that it looked like this part of the exercise led to some, perhaps a bit of movement away from personal to a broader canvas. This is just an example of whether there was any movement of opinion during the day. I'm only showing one of these because of time, but this was on the shared accommodation rate. So at the beginning of the day, this one, 6 was strongly opposed to it. Another 6 were somewhat against it. 2 were very much in favour, 2 were somewhat in favour, and 3 were undecided. So
when you say in favour, Mark, do you mean in favour of abolishing, or in favour of the device?
In favour of the device.
Yeah.
So the three undecideds made up their minds part of the day. So we get, and there's also some movements to strongly disagreeing. So we have 9 strongly disagree, 5 somewhat disagree. But we also, one of the undecideds went to the somewhat agree camp. So it wasn't all one direction. What are the implications and limitations? Well, as I suggested at the beginning, that very often social policy is assessed in very narrowly utilitarian ways. And I think although these kind of utilitarian stroke consequentialist argument came up a bit in the prioritisation exercise, I think the workshops revealed fairly strong attachment to kind of what I think of bedrock values of right to home, I think came up and would, on occasion trump need. Yeah. Dignity was pretty strong, in particular in relation to shared accommodation. Needs are unrelated to age, that was pretty strong. And consistency of treatment also came out as a strong value. But of course, this was a very limited exercise. So doing this with two workshops clearly limits how strong your conclusions can be. So I think that the value of the exercise was, has some value in relation to the policies, but also I think it's quite a useful learning experience for us in terms of trying out these deliberative approaches.
Yeah, lots of fascinating material there. A little bit difficult if you didn't know what the policies were before, but I think hopefully Mark's explanation was sufficient. So who'd like to comment or ask any questions? Ali?
Sorry, I was just sitting here trying to understand the policy. So my research focuses on shared housing in Greater Sydney. I was rapidly Googling while you were explaining the shared accommodation. So is it, from my basic Googling understanding, anybody who lives in a share house can apply for that shared accommodation discount? Is that correct?
No, what it is that historically, housing benefit is based on your actual rent.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there were limits on the mechanisms for excessive marketing, but that anyone, single person could rent a 1-bedroom flat, for example, and that would be no problem. But what the shared accommodation rate says that if you are single without dependents, then the most that we will pay, the state will pay, will be based on the prevailing rent in shared accommodation in your area. So you could choose to live in a 1-bedroom flat, self-contained, but you get the rent on which the benefits based would be on a shared accommodation, so it would be less. So you'd have to find money from somewhere else.
Yeah.
So I mean, there are people in work who get housing benefit, but there are a lot of people who aren't. And if you were in work, it wouldn't be a very high income you could get.
So it's kind of based on the assumption, on the justification. Part of the justification is that the social expectation that young single people up to some age will frequently do share houses.
Yeah.
And therefore, let's sort of institutionalize that and say that initially 26 is a reasonable age below which you should be expected to live in a shared house. And if you want to live in a more expensive place, fine, you can, but the amount we're going to give you assumes that you're only living in that cheaper form of housing. And then later, well, let's say 35 instead of 26. So that made it a lot more controversial. I think that's right, isn't it? So yes, it's a little bit hard to get your head around, isn't it?
So is it a much benefit? Like is it?
So it saves money basically for government. That's essentially it's a means of one of the many ways of reducing the social security expenditure is at the expense of that group.
Yeah, I mean the context for raising it from, I think the context for when it was first introduced in the mid-90s was probably more kind of moral in inverted commas. You know, why should low-income taxpayers pay for these young people to live independently? They should stay with their parents until they can afford to, kind of thing. But taking it up to 35, which was done, I don't know, about 2012, around then. This was the austerity era when the government was trying to reduce public expenditure, and the cost of housing benefit had rocketed, mainly because of the growth in the private rented sector. So that it had gone over £20 billion a year. So they were very anxious to find ways to haul it back, and so that was one of the ones that measures they took. I mean, no real political backlash against it in public discourse.
Andrew,
Great question. Mark, do you have any sense of? I mean, my understanding of the findings is that these values, like I guess more cultural values around home and the importance of having the kind of benefits, social and psychological, that flow from that kind of trump utilitarian considerations, the kind that would typically inform policy making. Do you have any sense of why? Do people give a sense of why that is the case?
I mean, I think these are all situations people could relate to and perhaps experienced as well. So, and I think. Well, that's a good question. You can tell that.
Take it on notice.
I mean, people have an experience of how people really live their lives. They're not. They are more complicated, and housing is about more than just allocating space in an efficient manner, because the idea of home is not it's a very easy to understand intuitively what it means, something more than security and all those things, and the sympathy towards pensioners who are under occupying their houses and get the council tax discount. People understand that was their family home and that they're reluctant to give it up because it has a whole lot of meaning to them. Whereas, civil servants or indeed researchers who are just looking at a spreadsheet, just say, oh, there are all these people who are under occupying these,
especially those who've been trained in economics, probably.
Yes.
Lee.
Yeah, actually, it's sort of a follow-up to that. Were your findings surprising to you, or do you think they'd be surprising to policymakers in terms of the importance of that idea of home?
I was a bit surprised. I was surprised about. I was surprised about people's relative attachments or views on these policies. So, I think I was surprised that the council tax discount was like the lowest priority for keeping, and I was surprised about the strength of feeling about the shared accommodation rate. The language that was used around that. So, yes, I was surprised by that, and from a research perspective, I was pleased that there were differences of opinion, and that people were comfortable in expressing those. All the groups worked pretty well. they got on well and entered into the spirit of it, if you like, and took it pretty seriously. So we're quite pleased with that, I think, because they were long days. So there was a good 2/3 of the day.
Bruce and Henry and then Richard.
With the so-called bedroom tax, really intended to encourage people to downsize, to move. Is there anything? Were there existing housing stock from able to do that? Was there any assistance given to people to move?
I mean that's the crux of the matter. Is that
Catch-22.
social housing was built, with larger families in mind, from the 1920s onwards, and of course households have got smaller since then. So there's obviously a lot of under occupation or in the sector. So if there were smaller social apartments that people could downsize to, then there would be more support for the policy. But there aren't. So people largely stay where they are and just get less support. So the effect is to save money. I mean, I suppose if the policy worked in the sense that people did downsize, then they would have to downsize into the private rented sector, and so their rents would be higher and the benefit they get would be higher. And the people moving in would fully occupy them, so they would get the full workmax as well. So if it worked in that sense, it would probably cost them more.
Are they able to sublet people to fill those extra bedrooms?
Well, that's the kind of thing that the politicians would say. Well, people could sublet. Well, then you get back to, I don't want to share my house with a stranger, or I don't want my kids to have to share a house with a stranger.
That didn't work either.
So the New South Wales government produced a sort of pale imitation of it, where you only were subjected to this penalty if you were offered a suitable small property and said, no, don't want it. And if that was a reasonable rejection, and no doubt there were plenty of appeals against such offers, then you would. But in the British case, no. I mean, you whether there was anywhere that you could move to or not, whether you'd be delighted with an offer, but there isn't any such property, you still got slugged with the penalty. And obviously there was quite a lot of awareness of that. That it was punitive. Well, the word punitive came up.
Yes.
Henry.
Yeah. So, firstly, thank you. It's really interesting. But just so it would be really interesting, I think, too. Obviously, you said it was just 2 studies, so obviously, sort of quite limited in what's been done so far. But it would be interesting to see the relative order and how it changed, and also just the intra reaction to the changes. If you change like the counterpoint made, so with the singles one, so where you essentially did council tax discount, that would be like the comparison there was against another single who was on a much higher income, so essentially didn't really meet the discount. But it would be interesting to make the comparison against, for example, a couple on a comparative income, or possibly a couple on a single income. So, you can create a scenario there where it's like, okay, a couple both on the same income, probably extra cash because of just the dual income situation. Mm-hmm. Okay, well, what if we take a couple who now are actually in a harder situation because they're on a single income? Mm-hmm. So,
it's interesting. I mean, in various attempts to reform this tax, the council tax, well, the Scottish government had a go at it about 7 years ago. They set up a commission on local tax, and I think there were some workshops with the public around that. And I mean, you get mixed values coming out with property taxation. So, there are people who believe that wealth should be taxed, but there's also a very, very, very strong view that everything is on the ability to pay which means out of current income. So income seems to trump everything. So there's so the sort of asset rich, income poor argument seems to be very, very powerful. But yes, I mean, we could, I mean, one could create more elaborate and more counterpoints to try and elucidate different values and priorities.
Of course, it brings with it its own challenges. I mean, the more counterpoints you create, the more people you need, and the more complicated the
It becomes more complicated. Yes.
Richard.
I'm interested how you plotted the people's views before and after. They've sort of become more diverse, more further apart from the middle, as it were. So I was sort of wondering, I mean, you'd expect as people discuss these things to get more of their opinion. I wanted to know whether people actually changed their minds too much, or whether it was very much like, well, I'm one of these sorts of people, I've been those policies, I'd like to see more of that, and they sort of rationalise what they were doing. Because I sort of get the feeling that politically, the sort of people who vote for one party would support one sort of set of policies, and the sort of people who vote for the other would support the other policies. And so it might be that what's ethically right doesn't actually what gets voted on, because no one changes their mind based on what the policy says. So I'm just wondering what your feeling generally is. Do you find that the policies align with the ethics, or just with what's politically popular for the vote base?
We didn't ask people about their politics, so we don't know. I suppose that might have added another element to it, but I guess there might also be some risk if you introduce the sort of party affiliation thing into it, in case you kind of get a reverse kind of thing, that if the government's doing this and you vote for the government, so does that mean therefore you have some, I don't know, but does that therefore mean that you therefore feel obliged, if you like, to defend the policies that you voted for? I don't know.
Are these what button issues, by the way, or are these like just obscure things people don't really worry about?
Well, yes. I mean, the shared accommodation rate didn't really enter political consciousness or public discourse, I don't think at all.
Yeah.
There were demonstrations against the organised and with reasonable turnouts against the bedroom tax. That seemed to have some resonance. There was some sort of campaigning history around that the government didn't call it the bedroom tax. The opponents of it adopted that, coined that term, and it was meant to resonate with another unpopular tax in the 80s and early 90s, which became known as the poll tax, which led to very large demonstrations and very high levels of civil disobedience, not paying it. So the campaigners were kind of, I think, trying to hit that, revive that kind of anger, if you like. And in Scotland, it became prominent because it was being introduced during the Scottish independence referendum in 2014. And so supporters of independence said, well, this is what being in the UK brings. It brings a bedroom tax, and we don't have the powers to change it. So of course, then the other side said, oh, well, you can have those powers. so then the Scottish government was pretty much obliged to use them to deal with it. So it wasn't exactly a model of policy making. And in Northern Ireland, as I understand it, Sinn Féin, the main nationalist party in Northern Ireland, promised their people that we'll get rid of this, and even though they didn't really have the money to do it, then because of the sensitivities, shall we say, in Northern Ireland, then the money was found. So it did gain political legs, but I'm not sure that the actual general population felt so strongly about it. the council tax has always been quite has more traction because lots of voters of any party benefit from the single person's discount. So you know, because it's not income related. And of course support for the Conservative Party is strongest amongst old elderly people, so that they would have a big constituency who benefit from that. I think that would be pretty politically safe, to be honest.
We need to finish very soon, but Lee has got a question, or
Just
maybe
a
a question
question
from someone online. Yes, thank you, Lee.
And the question was, have you presented these results back to government at any level? And if